Good morning. Happy Friday. I'm Rachel Warreno from CTA. Welcome. Today, our speakers for this press briefing include President David Goldberg of the California Teachers Association. CTA is a union of 310,000 educators across California's K through 12 public schools and our community colleges. And also joining us today is Karen Getman, partner of Olson Remchow and a constitutional law expert. Just want to give a couple details before we get started with our program this morning. This is a webinar, so folks can ask questions in the Q&A, and our staff will either answer in the moment or provide details for how we're going to be able to follow up with you after. We want to make sure everyone has all the information that they need. We have dedicated staff to answer questions in real time about the budget, Proposition 98, and our plan moving forward. The staff running our Q&A include Lori Easterling, Manager of Legislative Relations at California Teachers Association, and also from CTA are Katie Hardiman, Legislative Advocate, and Jackie Howard from our communications team. We will also be emailing out a press release soon after this concludes with more details, including background information and analysis on Proposition 98 and the state budget. And just one more note, we are recording today as well. And with that, I'd like to kick it over to CTA President David Goldberg.
Good morning, folks, and thank you for being here. And as Rachel said, I am your CTA President, David Goldberg. I am also, for purposes of this conversation, I'm a third-generation educator. So my grandmother started teaching third grade in the 1930s in LA Unified, and later I started in the 1990s. So my mother as well. So this is I'm taking a long-term view, and like many educators, I'm in this for the long haul. I'm also a parent of students, LA Unified students, whose education was deeply impacted for their entire education career because of cuts that happened in the Great Recession. So I'm really bringing in multiple perspectives. I'm bringing the perspective of an classroom educator and as a union president and as a parent here today. And we're here to share with you all our analysis of the governor's proposed May revise and our fundamental objections to any erosion to our public education funding. And frankly, also our plans to fight back and fight forward for our students in public schools and community colleges. So many of you know, last week, the Governor Newsom shared a brief overview of his plans for funding our public education system. And this past Tuesday, we were given more details. And the information shared with us, I could tell you, is completely unacceptable to educators. Because in addition to cuts to essential public services, the governor outlined his intentions to implement an unconstitutional maneuver with our guaranteed public education funding. And that's public education funding, again, that is enshrined in our Constitution that was passed by voters, Prop 98. And this maneuver that he's seeking to do would wreak havoc on funding for our schools for years to come and ultimately harm students. Prop 98, when it was passed, it was meant to be the floor. And when you start having maneuvers that all of a sudden say the floor is not really the floor, what that means for educators and students is untold harm. Before we get into details of our analysis and the unconstitutional proposed changes, I want to make it clear, very crystal clear, where the 310,000 educators of CTA stand on this proposal and this budget overall. So we acknowledge, all of us do, that our state is facing a massive deficit. But we also refuse to accept that our students' educational experience be defined by years of cuts. Students deserve more resources today. We are here in the 5th biggest economy in the world in California, and yet our education funding lanks towards the bottom or hopefully get towards the middle. So our students need smaller class sizes, school counselors, nurses, and librarians, not less. And then what they do not need is an uncertainty of not knowing if the floor of Prop 98 is actually the floor or something that at a whim can be changed. And then there's a new floor that's billions of dollars less. So just a reminder, together, Californians overwhelmingly passed Proposition 98 to protect school funding in good times and in bad. And that was passed back in 1988. And by every metric we see, polls, conversations with parents and community members, it's clear that Californians are still committed to funding our schools today. Now, we have a boom and bust cycle of our California state budget that ultimately harms students. It's educators always just being on survival mode. And it's never been more clear that we have to address that lack of consistent and stable funding for our schools. California is an amazing place to live. As I said, I'm 4 generations now in California. And from Calexico to Crescent City, California is incredible. What a gift we all have. And by the way, 1 in 8 students in this nation are in school in California. So what happens in California has a huge impact around the nation. But also, it's another stat that's important to know, that 1 in 5 students come to school hungry in California. And so the resources that we use are not extra resources. These are resources that are serving some of the most vulnerable students in this nation. So we all deserve stronger and more robust and consistent revenue in our state to fund the public institutions that are bedrock of our society. We know we have work to do in the years ahead to rectify this systemic funding problems. But we're here today with a massive deficit that has to be addressed. And simply put, budgets are a reflection of values, even more when times get tough. So we've heard the presentation from Governor Newsom, and we've also heard, frankly, hollow promises of protecting public school funding today at the expense of funding schools in the future. And make no mistake about it, this quote unquote maneuver on Prop 98 is an outright assault. And that's how we take it, as an assault on public school funding. A significant part of the governor's budget is to deem $8.8 billion that was allocated and appropriated to schools in the 2022-2023 as prepayments of amounts due sometimes in the future that should not count, according to him, for purposes of calculating the Prop 98 guarantee moving forward. This deeming maneuver reduces the Prop 98 guarantee by nearly $12 billion, $12 billion for the 23, 24, and 24-25 fiscal year. The Department of Finance rationale for the reduction is that last year, because of delay in tax payments, it misjudged how much income and tax revenue would receive. And so they're saying they over appropriate more general fund money to schools than the minimum required by the Constitution. And again, Prop 98 was always supposed to be the minimum, the bottom, the floor. And so now if you start taking away the floor, it sends a terrible precedent. So eroding our guarantee as proposed would harm schools for years to come and create the conditions for larger class sizes, fewer counselors, school nurses, and mental health professionals. And furthermore, just let me be absolutely clear, this maneuver at the very core violates our Constitution. So let me now introduce to you Karen Getman, who's an expert on Prop 98, far more than I am. And as you've heard earlier, Karen has decades of experience in California, including around Prop 98 and drafting, defending Prop 30 and 55, landmark school funding policies passed with overwhelming support from California voters. She's also, by the way, served as the chair of the California Fair Practices Commission. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, David. And thank you, CTA. I've had the great honor of representing CTA on budget issues, and particularly on Proposition 98 since 1989. And in that time, we've seen quite a few budget upturns and budget downturns. Proposition 98, which is enshrined in the California Constitution, provides protections and mechanisms that have been used many times in the past to ensure that even in times of economic downturn, funding for California's schools is secured. While purporting to protect education funding for this current budget year, the May revision solution to the state's current and ongoing budget deficit is actually premised on a substantial and ongoing cut in public school funding. Specifically, the May revision proposes an unconstitutional reduction to the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee of nearly $12 billion. That will lower school funding this year and for years to come and will open the door to future manipulation of the Proposition 98 guarantee. For background, as David mentioned, the California voters passed Proposition 98 to guarantee that public schools, and that's from transitional kindergarten through grade 12 and including community colleges, receive at least the same amount of general fund appropriations and allocated property tax revenue in any given year as they received in the prior year, and to ratchet up that guaranteed amount over time. Proposition 98 added Article 16, Section 8 to the California Constitution. The voters have repeatedly rejected attempts to weaken its core purpose. It sets the floor for school funding, not the ceiling. This is not the state's first budget crisis since Proposition 98 was first approved by the voters. Proposition 98 has accommodated ways to handle a budget crisis consistent with the Constitution and statutes, and without wreaking havoc on the goal of funding a better public school system in California. This includes temporarily providing a lower level of funding to schools while protecting the Proposition 98 guarantee going forward. This administration is not following that path. Instead, they are trying to rewrite history in order to drive down the Proposition 98 guarantee going forward. And here's how. The state provided about $76 billion in general fund money to schools last year. It's 22-23. That fiscal year is now over. The money has gone out. The money's been spent. But the administration now says that it didn't have to provide that much under the revised Proposition 98 guarantee. So it wants to pretend that it only gave schools about $67 million, not the $76 billion that the schools actually received and spent. We enacted a certification statute some years ago, and by we, I mean the legislature, the governor, and the school community all worked together on it. This is Education Code 41206.03. And it was at the urging of the Department of Finance. It addresses explicitly what happens in a year in which the state provides funding above the minimum guarantee. It says, and I quote, when the state has applied monies for the support of school districts and community college districts in an amount that exceeds the minimum required by Prop 98 for the fiscal year being certified, the excess money shall be credited to the fiscal year being certified. In other words, by statute, the $8.8 billion provided in 22-23 above that revised guarantee level must get counted when calculating the Proposition 98 guarantee for 23-24. This is consistent and required by the Constitution. The Constitution clearly states that in calculating this year's Proposition 98 guarantee, the state must look at the total amount appropriated and allocated to schools in the prior year. Instead of following the statute and the Constitution, the administration is subtracting that $8.8 billion from the total amount of general fund revenues that were in fact appropriated to schools in 22-23. It can't take them back because the fiscal year is over, so instead it's deeming them to have somehow be a prepayment of amounts that will be due sometime in the future. And it says that they don't count as appropriations for purposes of calculating the Proposition 98 guarantee. That's a fiction with no basis in fact or law. Instead, it treats that $8.8 billion as though it were a loan to the schools. That maneuver was previously used under the Pete Wilson administration, and it was declared unlawful in the CTA versus Gould litigation. These illegal maneuvers are being used by the administration to assert that the Proposition 98 guarantee for 23-24 is $6.8 billion below where it should be, and that the 24-25 guarantee is $5.1 billion lower than it should be. This helps the state solve its budget crisis by permanently cutting school funding. There are other paths. For that, I want to turn it back to David.
Thank you so much. So just in closing, we want to be respectful of folks' time. So I just want to be clear about some of our next steps. So in the coming weeks, we're going to be really making a concerted effort to call on our elected leaders to demand protection of school funding. We're also going to be launching a public campaign on Monday, May 20th, this coming Monday, that includes advertisements to raise awareness about this unconstitutional maneuver. Many folks, again, what happens around these big budgets can be a mystery to folks, but we want to be perfectly clear and have voters and members of our communities know exactly what's going on. It's critical for our communities to know that any discussion about eroding the floor for funding of our schools is going to harm students. It's imperative that the general public understand what's at stake. We are open to working with anybody. The governor, in a lot of ways, has been a great ally to public education, and so has the legislature. And we're open to any solutions and talking through any different ideas. But what we are not open to at all is any gimmicks that put years of gains of public school funding in jeopardy. That is not negotiable for us. And we will not accept proposal to cut funding from classrooms today, and we will not accept proposal to cut funding from classrooms in future year. It's time really to move forward and be the state that really all of us, our students, our educators, and every citizen of California deserves. That's what we're going to do, and that's what we're going to stand up for CTA. Thank you for joining us today. I'll now go back to Rachel Areno and see if there's any questions or things that I know some of them have been answered in live time, but see if there's anything for Karen or I.
Hi, folks. Yeah, I'll just emphasize again that for everyone who joined, we will be sending out more information that goes a little bit more in depth on the analysis around Proposition 98 and the state budget. David, we did have one question that was raised around CTA's response for other services that have the potential for cuts this upcoming year in the budget. If you want to speak to that, that'd be good in live time.
Sure. Look, I think we're clear about our students. And I said before, and I think the question is about pitting education funding against other services. And we want to reject any of it. Look, we need to increase the pie for all services in California. That's why, for example, CTA was one of the biggest supporters and active supporters and funders of Prop 15, which is about schools and communities first funding. And unfortunately, that did not pass. But we know that's also, we don't want to get caught up sometimes in a false division as if, look, our students, as I said earlier, 1 in 5 of our students are coming to school hungry. Those same services are doubly impacting students when you cut public education. 4 in 10 of our children in California rely on Medi-Cal. These are the children in our classrooms, and we will always advocate for their health and well-being as well as being at the school. We're looking at different models, including community schools, which puts what happens, tears down the barriers between the community and our schools, and really in a way that really is indicative of how our schools are part of our community and our communities are part of our schools. And so I think sometimes we got to make sure that we don't get caught up in a false distinction as if pitting one another against each other. We all deserve more, everyone in the state.
Thank you. And there's one other that popped up from John Fensterwald with EdSource to Karen, going over the impact on funding on the 23-24 and 24-25 school years and how we derive those numbers with the 8.8 billion built into the base. We could also follow up with John afterwards, but I wanted to open it to you.
But basically, what's happening is that the governor's proposal is taking that 8.8 billion out of the base. It's pretending it doesn't exist, literally just saying, ignore that $8.8 billion that we gave in 22-23. So they subtract it out when they calculate the base for 23-24. And that has the impact of lowering the base, changing the test that we're in and lowering the base. There's another maneuver they're doing with something called spike protection that has the same impact and that also is being done in a way that we think is inconsistent with the Constitution. But it is that fundamental lowering of the base by subtracting out the 8.8 billion when calculating the base for 23-24 that causes the problem. And then that carries over into 24-25, because 24-25, again, looks back on the prior year. So that's where we get that about $12 billion lowering of the base just for those 2 years. It does carry forward.
Okay, I'm answering question. It looks like all have been answered. Oh, there is a question actually from Blake Jones and Politico. Is there a threat of a lawsuit? Is it worth litigating this to set a precedent, even if a lawsuit wouldn't be settled until after the budget deadline? And David, do you want to take that one?
Sure, maybe I'll do it, and then Karen's probably much more knowledgeable. I guess, and Blake, good to hear from you. I guess what I would say is, look, we are open to any and all strategies and tactics. What we will not stand by and let this happen. So again, this is a clear violation of the Constitution. So when you have clear violations of the Constitution, often you go to legal remedies. So that is definitely one of the tools in our toolbox. And again, and you're right, Blake, it will not solve it right away. But the precedent that comes by having any elected person to basically say the floor is no longer the floor, and we're going to cut $12 billion or more, when it compounds over for students for the future and educators, that cannot stand. So we're looking to, again, negotiations and conversations are ongoing. We want to say anything is a fait accompli. In fact, what we're trying to do right now is really raise people's awareness and have the legislature know and have the governor know about what's really at stake, and about how students and educators and our union is really depending on them to really get this right. So hopefully it doesn't come to a lawsuit, but any tactic, any strategy is one that we'll have to explore, including and up to lawsuits.
Okay, I think we answered all of the questions that have come through. And again, we're going to be following with folks in email, and really just want to say thank you for everyone this morning for being here, and we'll be hearing from us shortly. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, David.
Thank you, folks.